Hello, hello to all our viewers, and hello to Lioz Guttman, who's joining us from Recife in Brazil. Lioz is an OPAN teacher, which means he teaches Hebrew. So, Lioz, let's get right to it. Who's your audience? Who do you teach Hebrew to?
Mostly to people who live in Israel and to people who want to be able to communicate in Hebrew while living in Israel. But I also have diplomats that I teach that spend only a few years in Israel, and also mostly Jewish people from abroad, but not only. Um, this is it mostly.
Okay, but you are open to teaching other people as well, right? People who just want to learn Hebrew for other reasons.
Yes, yes, definitely. I had researchers that investigate the Hebrew language or maybe Hebrew script, and also people that I had a student from England that was studying theology. He wanted to look into the Bible in Hebrew. So it's not only Jewish people, definitely not. Also, diplomats are mostly, I mean, when they come to Israel, most of them are not Jewish. Not that it matters to me, you know.
Yeah.
Whoever wants to study with me, go ahead.
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, Hebrew is the native speaking population is very small. So it's nice when non-Jews are interested in learning Hebrew. And I mean, one of the first things you learn are the greetings, right? Like Shalom, Boker Tov. Tell us what's the first thing you tell students who join you for class?
The first thing that I teach,
Yeah, yeah.
well, I teach the way I like to learn when it comes to languages in general. So yeah, we have this part of introduction, of good morning, how are you, what's your name, where are you from, and these kind of things. But I like to teach the fundamental part of speech. So people, I like to give the added value as a teacher because memorization and repeating things you can do with YouTube, you can do with a tape. You don't need a teacher. But I try to teach my students the structures and patterns they could use afterwards to fill in themselves. So they can understand the logic behind the language and they can expand their knowledge. If they hear, for example, a word on the street, they can conjugate it in all tenses and for all pronouns and stuff like that. So this is what I like to teach mostly. So from the very beginning, I like to show it to my students, especially Hebrew, which is a language which is based mostly on consonants as opposed to other languages which have a lot of vowels. We don't write all the consonants. So it's important to connect the vowel sounds that are pronounced with what we see on the paper. So this is something I like to focus on when teaching from the very beginning.
I like that. I like that. Um, get into what Hebrew is because like if what Hebrew what is Hebrew? What family of languages does it belong to?
So Hebrew belongs to the Semitic family of languages, more specifically the Canaanite branch or group of languages, which the Semitic language is actually Afro's Asiatic family of languages because it's spoken in the Middle East area and in East Africa and also along the north side of Africa, as opposed to the major group of Europe, which is the Indo-European languages, which is a very big group of languages spoken in all of America nowadays, and most of Europe, and all the way to Western China also, through India. So this is, yeah, your language.
Yeah, yeah, but Hebrew still does have some correlation with the alphabets, alphabet, right? Like there is some correlation between the at least the written script, right? Or am I?
Between the Latin letters and ours and the Hebrew letters. Definitely. The letters and the way we write today, which is very sophisticated, we're used to it, but it's very sophisticated because we have the graphic representation for each consonant and for each vowel, which help us write every single word. That doesn't matter whether it's Hebrew or English, and we only have to know about 2 dozens or a little bit more letters to memorize that in order to be able to read and write. And this invention was actually it is actually originated in the region of Israel. Yes, and the Hebrew alphabet that we use today is not the first one. Um, it started with the Phoenicians, that were probably inspired by Egyptian hieroglyphs. Am I pronouncing it right?
Look, hieroglyph. I'm also not sure how to pronounce. Look,
Okay. Okay. Um, anyway, the whole story there, but from the Phoenicians, also like the Greek people, they traded. They used to trade, and they had ships, and that's why they formed connections all over the Mediterranean. And also, the method of writing was transferred to other peoples, to the Greeks and to other civilizations. From there to Romans and everywhere. Um, However, the letters have changed a little bit because, as I said, Hebrew as a Semitic language is based mostly on consonants, and Indo-European languages have a lot more vowels and less consonants. So, where a letter represented a consonant that did not exist in European languages, it shifted its purpose maybe to a vowel, to help filling up the gap. So, but it's interesting to trace back the origin of the letters and to see how they started with a word that sometimes till this very day we use in Hebrew because Hebrew is a Semitic language. For example, B and Beit, which comes from the word Bait, which means a home or a house. So yeah, Dalet is a delet, a door. D, yeah.
oh right, Dalit is makes sense. Yes. Um, you just said was what you talked about was evolution of language. Hebrew really is the basic Jewish language, but we do have a lot of other Jewish language. I said Hebrew is, the basic Jewish language, but we do have a lot of other languages, Jewish languages that evolved over time, just as much as from Phoenician we got Hebrew, it went to Greek, it to Latin. Could you tell us a bit about the Jewish languages that evolved over the millennia?
Right. First, we have to distinguish the letters, which you just mentioned, the evolution of the letters from Phoenician to Hebrew to all kind of letters to European languages, which is one thing. And we have the actual spoken language because writing languages came in a much later phase in history or even prehistory, right? So, yeah, besides Hebrew, there are the other languages that you might refer to are languages that are used by Jewish communities around the world, right? So we have a few examples like Ladino, like Yiddish, like Judo-Italian, Judo-Arabic, which are, by the way, Judo-Arabic is not one language. We talk about four languages here, depending on the Arabic-speaking country where the Jews live. It's no longer spoken, but Yiddish and Latino are still spoken, and also Judeo-Italian and specifically Judeo-Roman is spoken still by some people. And these are basically mixture of languages. For example, Yiddish is very similar to German, and therefore it's considered a Germanic language, which is a branch of the Indo-European languages. And Ladino, which is very similar to Spanish, is considered Romance language. So these are specific languages that are used by the community, the Jewish communities in specific places. Yiddish mostly in Eastern Europe, I mean, and Ladino. These Jews that mostly in Greece, sorry, and Turkey and Balkan by Jews, that Sephardic Jews, and then we have also Aramaic, which is a completely different thing because Aramaic was used as the it was used in the but in the empire, right? Of
Christian.
no,
Okay.
sorry, I kind of wait a second. I'm gonna look at my notes.
Yeah. We'll just
So we have Aramaic that was used was the lingua franca in the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. Usually, I speak about these things in Hebrew. I'm sorry about that. So yeah, so when the first big exile to before Babylon even to um, Assyria. No, I'm sorry. Yes, and then Babylon took over, and some of the people of Israel returned to build the second temple. Right. So in this epoch, this time, Aramaic became the lingua franca in this area, and that's why the Talmud, which was written a few centuries after the one that was written in Babylon, in this which is called Talmud Bavli, is in Aramaic. But there is also Talmud which was written in Jerusalem, which is a Jerusalemite Talmud, which is written in Hebrew. And also the Mishnah, which the Talmud is based on, is written in Hebrew. Both parts, because this part was written in Israel. So it's not a Jewish language, but it's a language that is used a lot by Jews for books for the Talmud mostly.
You bring up some really amazing things because you're speaking to a Trinidadian audience largely, and we are largely an English speaking audience, population, sorry. But we do have our own mishmash of language, which we've created something called patois. It's also a dead language basically in Trinidad, but it was a mixture of English and French. And this is what happens whenever people travel, right? They make their own languages.
Yeah.
It's very common in history. Lioz, you brought up some terms in your last explanation. I hope you don't mind me asking if you could explain them for audience. Like, what is the Talmud? What is the Mishnah?
Okay. So Judaism is based on I mean, we call the people of the book for a reason. I mean, all the Jewish scripts and books are interpretations over interpretations over interpretations. So it starts with the five books of Moses, which is the Old Testament, which is what we call Torah. And then it continues with what we call the Bible, which is actually the Jewish Bible is the Old Testament. The Torah is only the first part of it. We don't consider the New Testament to be part of our Bible. It's not Jewish. But the next book that interprets the Torah is the Mishnah, which was written in Israel around the first century BC, something like that. And the books that interpret the Mishnah are called Talmud or Gemara. And some as I said, we have two types of Talmud. We have the one that was written in Jerusalem and the one that was written in Babylon. The one in Babylon is written in Aramaic, and the one in Jerusalem is written in Hebrew. And these books were written a little bit further on in history, like the early millennia, the first millennia, and many other books that follow till this very day that basically instruct people of day-to-day lives how to behave, what they should and shouldn't do. It deals with all kind of things, practical things as well. If a damage was done to, I don't know, back then to an animal, who has to pay for it? If an animal causes damage, who has to pay for it, and so on. This is just one example. There are many topics that are covered. Also, holidays like Hanukkah, the way you're supposed to light the menorah, for example. So it's all started there because this Chag, these holidays, has not appeared in the Bible. It came later on in history.
Leo, thank you. I think for Rabbi Lioz, because that was an incredibly great explanation. You touched on a lot of very interesting topics there. But one thing that up to me, and I think for a lot of people who want to learn Hebrew, is that there's a difference between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew. And between the two, because a lot of our audience will want to learn biblical Hebrew. Could you tell us if there's any fundamental difference between the two, biblical and modern Hebrew?
Definitely, there is, to the point that some linguists would consider modern Hebrew as a different language altogether. Um, I read a book by a linguist that refers to modern Hebrew as Israeli, not Hebrew. Yes. Biblical Hebrew is very different in terms of syntax and obviously vocabulary. A lot of the vocabulary nowadays in modern Hebrew is based obviously on roots. Okay, it's important to understand that Semitic languages, Hebrew included, are based on roots. Roots are usually three consonants which we use in different patterns, in different structures to create different words with similar meanings but not the same meaning. For example, if you use the root for writing, kaf, taf, bet, you can have words like corresponding, like writing, like dictating, like uh, carbon copy someone. This is more modern Hebrew that uses this old verb, old root. All right. So when people started using Hebrew again, they didn't make up words mostly. They took roots, existing roots, and sometimes it were existing roots and they reused them in structure where they're not used to in the Bible to create modern words. This is a good example, carbon copy. And sometimes they used words that they didn't know what they mean back then. For example, the word for electricity in Hebrew, which is chashmal, is actually mentioned in the Bible, but we don't really know what they refer to back then. So we use it for electricity nowadays. But okay, when I start talking about that, I go all over the place. But basically, the people that help renewing the language and helping with its rebirth, and the most famous one is Eliezer Ben Yehuda, of course. Their native tongue was Eastern European, right? So, and it's very interesting when I teach students whose language native tongue is Eastern European. Sometimes they find similarities, like Russian or Ukrainian or Polish. They say, "Oh, it's like in my language," and it has nothing. Historically, Hebrew and I don't know Polish has nothing to do with one another. But apparently, the people who helped reconstructing the language used some of the principles from their own language, and we have some kind of a mixture. Um, We did keep the method of conjugation, which I mentioned before, using roots. This is something that Semitic languages used, and it's not something that you have in the European languages. So this we still have this, which is unique to Semitic languages.
Yeah, that's and also something that out of this that script itself changed. The biblical script that find all over Israel when you go into archaeological sites, the script is different from what we read in Hebrew today. Could you tell me a bit about that discrepancy?
I couldn't hear the question quite well. You're breaking out a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said it brings us to this different script between biblical Hebrew
Script,
and modern Hebrew. Could you tell us about that discrepancy?
right? So the letters that we use nowadays is actually the Aramaic. The Hebrew, the modern Hebrew letters are Aramaic. They're not ancient Hebrew. But this has been around for almost 2,000. I mean, more than 2,000 years actually, because the reason is not quite clear why people. There is a so as I said, the origin of the letter is all the same, and different peoples in the Middle East area have formed different kind of letters. So the Hebrews had the ancient Hebrew letters, which they stopped using around during the time of the Second Temple. For some reason, some people think they wanted to differentiate themselves from uh, the, the other people that lived Samaritans, thank you, that used a version of the letters that looked a little bit like the ancient Hebrew alphabet. So they wanted to differentiate themselves from them. I'm not sure about that. It's a possible reason. But they switched to the Aramaic language. And this is the letter, I mean, not language, letters. And these are the letters that we use today. So it's not true that the Bible is written in a different language. If you read the newspapers and you read the Bible, you read the Torah, the way it's written on a scroll and everything, same letters, different fonts, obviously, but same letters. We do have another set of letters which is called ktav in Hebrew, which means handwriting or writing. And these letters we mostly use to handwrite. And also, it's interesting. I have another set of letters I want to mention, but first, not too many people know, but there used to be there is another set of letters, which is the Sephardic handwriting, which is no longer used. Yes, nowadays we use it. It's actually older than the Ashkenazic handwriting. Nowadays we use the Ashkenazic handwriting. It doesn't matter whether you're Sephardic Jew, Ashkenazi Jew, or it doesn't matter where you come from. If you learn how to write in handwriting, or if you were born in Israel, handwrite, you're going to use the Ashkenazic set of letters. But there used to be another one as well, which is more similar to Arabic. I can't read it. I I was actually looking, to looking online to see how it looks, and I can't read it. I need to study it. So it's not like lowercase and uppercase letters in Latin because we don't mix the two. One is used for print and the other one is used for handwriting mostly. And and then we have, maybe you've heard of Ktav Rashi writing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So that's another set of letters which its origin is not completely clear. We know that Rashi did not use it. It's named after him, but it didn't use it. I learned a version that it was due to bad printing system,
Oh.
but I can't be certain about that. But this is something this is a writing that we use mostly to write interpretation for the Torah. Like for example, interpretation of Rashi are usually interpretations of Rashi are usually written in Rashi writing, and I know how to read that due to my religious upbringing, but not everybody can read it. It's similar, but it's not the same.
Right. Right. Um, one of the things you said just now, which is very interesting, is that a group of people who brought Hebrew back. So you're saying that Hebrew was dead. Um, could you tell us what happened? Like, what? How did Hebrew die, and how was it reborn?
Right. Historically speaking, the last time Hebrew was spoken as a live language before the exile, the 2000 years exile, was in the state of Judea, which which was in Israel 2000 about 2000 years ago. You know, when we had the temple, the second temple, the one that Herod's he didn't build it, but he renovated it to make it as magnificent as it was. And back at the state of Judea, the Hebrew was a live language, and by referring to a live language, I mean that people spoke it in their day-to-day lives, and it was the first language of people. This is the language they spoke with their parents, and the language that they spoke with their children. And this is how language evolves and moves on from one generation to generation. But as you know from stories nowadays, you know, when people immigrate to another country where their language is not spoken, so the first generation still speaks the language at home, and the second one still because they heard it from their parents, but you know their friends already speak another language, and when they go shopping, they speak the local language, and they do business, they speak the local language, and whatever. And the third generation doesn't always they don't speak it anymore so much. And then the fourth generation, that's it, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
So this basically what happened, but Hebrew that's why we say it was a dead language because it wasn't passed on from one generation to another. But because it was used for reading the Torah and for all the interpretation that I mentioned earlier, that were still they still took place in Hebrew. And so it was used mainly for reading the Torah, obviously, and for learning all the books, the Hebrew books, but also for asking questions about halacha, which is the Jewish way of living according to their religion. So when asking specific question about how one should behave in a certain situation, so traditionally you would ask the rabbi that, and if you write a letter to the rabbi regarding that, sometimes the rabbi would live in a different country. If it's like a question which is a big issue, I don't know, coming up with a new thing, electricity, for example, you have to consult, and that would sometimes take place in Hebrew because it has to do with Jewish law. So Hebrew was kept, but it didn't keep up with modern, well, even before that, with life, you know, because life has changed so much,
Mm.
especially throughout the last century, that it needed an artificial way. Once people wanted to start speaking it again, it needed some kind of artificial help because it didn't happen naturally. And that's what happened during the last 150 years when people actively, like Ben Yehuda that I mentioned, actively came up with words and wrote dictionaries and wrote newspapers and insisted on conducting their lives in Hebrew so that the next generation, for them, it would be the natural language to speak, and which is amazing.
Yeah, it really is. And more than that, I mean, I think son was the first person to grow up being a native Hebrew speaker in modern times. This was early hundreds, right? Like he spoke only to his son in Hebrew, I think, right?
He yes, and he had where the story tells he had conflicts with his wife about that, and sorry, and I heard this story. I'm not sure how historically accurate it is. That he Eliezer ben Yehuda needed to go someplace, and his son did not speak till an older age, which happens actually also to children nowadays. When there are a lot of benefits of speaking multiple languages to a child, but usually one of the side effects that they start speaking later. And he did not speak Itamar, his son, and his mother wanted to put him to sleep, so she sang a song in another language, Russian or Ukrainian. I'm not sure. I don't want to say specific language. And Eliezer came back home earlier than expected, and he was so furious. He smashed the table, broke it, or something like that. And the little child was so startled, he said his first word, Abba, which means dad in Hebrew, which is kind of sad, you know, having to live in this kind of an environment, but whatever. You know, we owe a lot to him. But I think he was a very strict person.
One of the things that comes out of this is that Hebrew, because it was kept with the religious sphere, especially among Jews over the past 2,000 years, it became a sacred tongue. It wasn't a language that we spoke on the streets. It was a language that was kept for the synagogue, for the Bet Midrash, which is the house of learning. So there was opposition to Hebrew becoming the lingua franca of Israel, right? People may not have wanted to take this sacred holy tongue and put it out for us to talk about getting tickets to the cinema or buying tomatoes in the shuk in the market. So what happened? How did they actually end up choosing Hebrew, and what were some of the alternatives that they had to Hebrew when they were discussing in the beginning of Israel?
Well, the popular international language back then was German. And especially when you talk about science and academy, some people were supporting adopting German as a language, but other languages were suggested too. But the people that chose the language were not those people who wanted to keep the Hebrew in synagogues. Excuse me. It's important also to look at the international context, because exactly 100 years before the country of Israel was established in 1848, we witnessed the springtime of the peoples, where especially in Europe, each people wanted to come up with their own identity, national identity, and language, and history, and culture. And the people of Israel back then, which were scared, well, we still are, but back then we did not have the state of Israel. So they were influenced by this movement,
Mhm.
right? And adopting a language which is not our own, a language like German or French or whatever, it doesn't correspond with this idea of going back to the roots, of having your own identity and culture, and obviously language. So this is how we ended up not adapting, sorry, reviving our own language, and going back to the language that was spoken 2,000 years ago in the state of Judea in Israel.
That's such an important point because the rebirth of Israel alongside the rebirth of Hebrew, and the two go hand in hand. It's just you can't separate them. And I mean, there are efforts. This is a funny joke, though. This is not true, but English speakers who live in Israel are always like, oh, we should make English the language in Israel. Like, yes, it'll be easier, but it is beautiful to be able to speak in Hebrew in Israel. And I think it's impossible to separate the rebirth of Hebrew with the rebirth of the state of Israel. The two just go hand in hand. And that brings me to, you mentioned like electricity before. Hebrew being confined to the religious space for 2,000 years. Obviously, there were a lot of advancements, not even technology, there were advancements in food, potato, tomato. How did, especially that guy Ben Yehuda, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, how and the entire community who was so for Hebrew, how did they come up with some words that just didn't have any anchor in ancient Hebrew?
Right. So these two examples are interesting, actually, potato and tomato, because again, the use of roots and influence of European languages play a major part here. For example, potato, which is the fruit of the earth in European languages, also in Hebrew is called tapuach adama, tapuach apple or fruit, because also in European languages, it's interesting because um, apple used to be a generic word for fruit. So when you say tapuach adama, the fruit of the earth, it's like a translation from pomme de terre or other languages which I don't speak in Europe. But another example is the tomato, because also in French, the tomato was referred to as well as the fruit of love, pomme d'amour, and in Hebrew it's called agvania. And the root of agvania, ayin gimel bet, has to do with courting, wooing, or lusting for someone. Which is interesting because also, on a different note, syphilis in Hebrew has the same root. Agevet. So, yeah.
That's
So they did not just come up with random names. They used existing roots.
right. And also, oysters are not kosher, and oysters are known to be, the aphrodisiac of food. So maybe there's something that early Hebrew speakers in the 1900s knew about tomatoes, calling it associating it with love, right? Like maybe they knew something that we didn't know.
Maybe, I don't know. I was researching that. I was trying to research that about the origin of the name "fruit of love" in French, and there are some reasons for that. I have to further investigate.
Okay, I mean, because if you nice date night Italian food with a nice tomato sauce, maybe there's something in it that we don't realize yet.
But
Um,
in Italian they call it "fruit of the sun," so it's not
sun.
exactly
Okay,
the
well the Italians are natural
same.
lovers.
Sun or gold, pomador. Or is gold, I
Okay,
think.
okay. Um, so even up to today, Hebrew is still confronting a lot of modern technology, a lot of modern words. Leos, who is choosing the words that we have to adapt to, like Wi-Fi or computer or cell phone? Who's coming up with those words?
So here you have the fight between the people and the academy.
Right.
Like in many languages, academy comes up with many words, and some of them become part of the language, and some of them are just being rejected by the people. Like for example, a text message, right? There is a word in Hebrew, but people usually it is used in like commercials and stuff like that, but most people still use SMS when speaking Hebrew. And before we had this institute, also Eliezer Ben Yehuda came up with a lot of words for pajamas, for telephone, for things like that that did not stick.
Mm.
I know them as historical facts, but they did not stick, and nobody uses these words for pajamas and telephone, for example, or tissue.
Yeah. So,
So
yeah, it's the people who make a language. Academy could do what they want, but it's the people who.
exactly. They can come up with suggestions, but at the end of the day, if the people don't use their suggestions, I don't. Nobody, me personally, but I don't think nobody likes being instructed and being told, you should use this and you shouldn't use it. Each person has their own set of words that they use.
Yeah, yeah. Lioz, I want to shift and let's talk a little bit about you as an Ulpan teacher. Now, Ulpan being, could you explain what Ulpan is first to the audience?
So Ulpan is basically Hebrew school. It's a school for learning the Hebrew language. And Ulpan is one of the services that are given to new immigrants, to Olim, when they come to Israel. And I provide Ulpan services privately, and not only to new immigrants, not only to Olim Chadashim, also, as I said, to people worldwide, some diplomats and people that are not that cannot get the Ulpan services from the state,
Right,
or that they don't feel comfortable with the schedule or whatever.
right. Yeah. Ulpan Gordon. Yeah, not everyone likes Ulpan
It's very
Gordon.
intensive, yeah.
uh, could you talk a little bit about the curriculum and how it's structured to help people learn Hebrew? Because we have French coming in, English speakers, you have Russians, you have Ukrainians. There's so many languages, but there's one Ulpan curriculum. Could you tell us?
Right. So honestly, I never taught in a state Ulpan. And the Ulpan I used to teach in came up with their own method. This Ulpan eventually became an Ulpan that is recognized by the state, but it's a different method. So nowadays, we have different Ulpans, different methods that are recognized by the state, and people can go and get their Hebrew lessons over there paid by the state. But I can talk about my method. So it's very different. If you have 5 hours upon every day, 5 days a week, then you can use some immersion method, speaking Hebrew all the time, and teaching Hebrew in Hebrew,
Mm-hmm.
right? But when you only take a couple of hours in a week, I personally don't find it beneficial. So I start teaching Hebrew in English, or we gotta have some kind of common language, me and my students, for us to be able to communicate. So it's either mostly English, sometimes Spanish, because these are the two languages I can teach in. The others are I don't speak well enough. And as we go along, and as we expand the students' vocabulary and understanding of the structures and the conjugation structures, then we switch to Hebrew gradually. So this is how I do it. Also, if it's a group, sometimes I teach small groups as well.
I like your approach. I have a funny story about my Ulpan experience. Because she did the Israeli approach, which is we're teaching Hebrew in Hebrew, do not speak English in class. She came second or third class and she was like, Shalom, Nicholas. And I was like, Maze Shalom. I got I got so panicked. What's this? What's this Shalom? That's how I responded. But you said something there which is so important, I think, and why Israel was successful with getting people to speak Hebrew is the immersiveness of it, right? I don't think there's any other structure in the world where government went behind a language learning system the way the Israeli government and the Israeli structure did, obviously because they had to rebirth Hebrew. But the with you and your students specifically, because you said 5 hours a week, how do you help them immerse themselves if they're living outside of Israel?
Right. No, so most of my students take maybe a couple hours a week. I was talking about that amount of time as opposed to 5 hours a day, 5 times a week, which maybe immersion could work there because you're immersed in this kind of environment. But I encourage my students, which is very hard, especially in Tel Aviv, because Tel Avivians like to practice their English. But I encourage my students to stick with their Hebrew no matter what. If they're being spoken English, to keep trying to speak Hebrew, even though it's very difficult sometimes. Listen, listen, try to recognize words and structure that we learn in class. So also songs and TV shows could be a very good way of listening, and especially when you have subtitles, you can use the subtitles to maybe understand things that you missed. Pause. It could be frustrating, I know, because I've tried doing that in other languages, and it could be very very slow process, but. It's better to watch TV without pausing and get the Hebrew than not doing it at all. So maybe also some of my students have a partner who's Israeli. So and it's very hard for them to switch to Hebrew. So I tell them, listen, just do 15 minutes every day, but time it, and during these 15 minutes, speak only Hebrew. Because if you try to speak Hebrew all the time, very quickly you go to not speaking Hebrew at all with your partner. So 15 minutes every day where you speak only Hebrew. And then when you feel comfortable and the time goes by fast, you can switch to 20 minutes and maybe half an hour and then maybe an hour. So gradually. But also consistency is very, very important. This is one of the tips I can give language students or Hebrew, but any language.
Yeah.
It's better to do a little every day than a lot once a week.
Yeah. Yeah.
So consistency is the key.
Consistency, discipline. Yeah, that's how you learn. I mean, anything, not just languages, math,
Very true.
everything. Um,
Very true.
Israel is a secular country, but it was born from this language that we talk about that is very sacred and very holy. Uh, Tell me your thoughts about how I mean, because you are secular yourself, right? But you grew up religious. How does the religiousness of Hebrew still carry forward into the secular aspect of being really Jewish? Or is there any impact between the two? Does it influence you? And the reason I bring this up is for like people like Omer Adam who do songs, like Tel Aviv, which is the party song, and it's
Mhm.
taken from Shalom Aleichem, which is a religious song. So like I feel it would be an influence with the religiosity of Hebrew on of biblical of ancient Hebrew on today's Hebrew. And is there?
Well, religion is culture, and the Israeli culture is integrated with the Jewish culture. Obviously, there are parts that aren't, that are completely secular and have nothing to do with religion. Yes, there is this part as well, but it's very hard to completely separate. And maybe it will help. Maybe an example from the Christian world could help if you look at artists like Lady Gaga or Madonna that do songs like Little Prayer back in the 80s.
Mhm.
It's you can see it's a pop song,
Mhm.
but if you remember the video, it's totally really. I mean, the elements over there are religious, and it influences both in motives like melody, for example, because the song you mentioned have nothing, like the lyrics have nothing to do with Shalom Aleichem, but there's like a little phrase in the beginning, like a musical line from there. So it could be things that are not words, and it can be even style of Hebrew, which, for example, there is a comedian, Israeli comedian. This is some In order for this kind of job to work, you really have to understand Hebrew culture, because she speaks like modern Hebrew, and all of a sudden she could say a sentence which is something from the Bible or from something like that, which which is funny because of the contrast between the modern Hebrew and the biblical Hebrew. The way she uses it to convey a message which is completely stupid, like I mean insignificant. That's what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it makes it very very funny, but it's very hard to separate.
Yeah. I mean, that I did want to ask you, how do you, and this is a tough question, but how do you think Hebrew influenced and influences Israeliness? Because as you said, the Hebrew you speak is Israeli. It's not biblical Hebrew.
Yeah. Well, it is a tough question to answer, but I think I think if we try to consider or to imagine how Israel would look if we spoke a different language, English, for example. If English were Israeli, I mean the language in Israel nowadays, even though we have our own language, we still are so influenced by everything that's going around globally. Imagine if we had the same language. I mean, I think this is one side, but the other side, I'm thinking about other cultures that speak the same language, like Latin America versus, and different countries within it, obviously, versus Spain, still different languages. So I don't know, but it definitely gives us a unique aspect.
Mm.
Language, the Hebrew language is spoken only in Israel,
Mm-hmm.
so it makes us unique for sure. And also, Hebrew is a very direct language, and it may have to do with Israeli chutzpah and the way we approach things, which in its turn can help with development and with coming up with original ideas and cutting corners in a way that would benefit us. Getting to the point, getting to the bottom line. I would say tachles, you know, and I think this is probably one of the reasons why we're also a high tech nation. Yes.
I mean, you're absolutely right. To go back to the beginning of our conversation, Hebrew is a Semitic language, and it
Mhm.
is is into the region because this is a language. I mean, as you said, if we could imagine what Israel would have been had it been German or English or French, how could you integrate into the region around you? Even though Hebrew is not Arabic, there's still similarities that would give an average Israeli high school student a leg up to learn Arabic in the same way it would get an English speaker would be have a leg up to learn German, right? So, um, it really, to me, it anchors Israel in the region. It's the language that was there before. It's the language that's reborn. And what are your thoughts?
First, I think it's a shame that even though you have to learn some Hebrew in high school or middle or junior high, I did for a year, I think. I think most Israelis don't speak Arabic, and I think it's a shame as a second language, because we live in a region where Arabic is spoken, and a lot of Israeli citizens are Arabs. So this is my first. This is the first thing I feel. It's like it's a little bit of a shame, and also it's probably easier for us as Hebrew speakers to learn, for example, conjugation in Arabic, and some of the roots are derived from the same origins, or they're similar, or even the same. And having said that, modern Hebrew and Arabic are very different. Because of what I mentioned earlier. So we do have the same conjugation system and we do have the same origins, but the influence that came after from the people who helped reviving the language gave shifted it to a different direction.
Mhm.
So we have the language roots are here, and it's related to the Arabic and its surrounding, but then it also has the European influence.
Yeah. I mean,
Mhm.
I think you see learning second languages, not just in Israel, also here in Trinidad. We're right next door to Venezuela. We're 7 miles away from Venezuela. And like you, my Spanish, like you with Arabic, my Spanish is so basic. They never pushed it. We have a huge Venezuelan community in Trinidad now, and they are forced to learn English, whereas we don't speak Spanish. So I think the problem in Israel is the same everywhere, when you think you don't need to learn a second language. Um,
Right.
Lioz, I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope our viewers, I'm sure our viewers did as well, because we talked about so many different aspects of Hebrew, the history, the culture, what it is today, the jokes. What I would love to ask you, which is kind of funny, but which language group is the most resistant when it comes to learning Hebrew? Is it the English speakers? The
Wow, that's a very hard question to answer. I think it has to do with not with the mother tongue, but with the culture of studying in general. I can tell you that students that come from former Soviet Union are very hardworking, and they usually learn more quickly because they study hard.
Mm,
Um, well, maybe maybe children. Well, not only children, teenagers, because very often they're being forced
mm,
into learning a language. So it's not about language or ethnicity. It's about age group. I don't like personally to teach people who don't want to study or learn, so I try to avoid that. But I did teach a few gap year programs, and if the students are not into that, they're resistant, and it's really hard for me as a teacher, and for them obviously too. They're not going. If they don't want to, they're not going to learn.
yeah. It has to be your innate desire to want to where it comes from.
Anything, but especially a language.
Yeah. Yeah. Lioz, well, thank you so much. This has been Lioz Guttman. Lioz is actually going to join us for another interview on another topic in the future. But today he spoke to us about his experience as an OPAN teacher. He came to us with all of his education and knowledge about Hebrew, and I'm sure our viewers really appreciated this, Lioz. I appreciated it a lot. It was very enjoyable speaking with you. You're in
Thank you.
Brazil. How long are you in Brazil again for? How long are you in South America for again?
I'm not sure. It depends on many things, but in Brazil, a few weeks.
A few weeks. Um, Eventually, we will hope that our community here would be willing. Those among us who are willing to learn would use you as their OPAN teacher. They can see you're very patient, you're very kind. I think you'll be a great teacher for any of our listeners who are willing to learn about Hebrew. And at the bottom of this video, we'll have your information, how they can contact you to get you for online classes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here, Lioz. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank
Thank,
you so much. Have a great day.
thank you. Litorot.
להתראות.
Bye bye.